From the Diary of Jake Sato, dated May 11th, 2019. I've always tried to rationally think through how we got here. What happened to lead us down this path? Why did life turn out like this? When I do, my mind always comes back to that summer's day in Scotland. Everything stems from that like a collapsed vein, a happier time cut off from us in the past, and nowhere else to go but this tainted present. Back in 1977, my wife Jenna and I saw something neither of us could comprehend. It changed us forever. We were staying in a small Scottish village called Aberfoyle for 1 week at a time. It was a quaint place surrounded by pleasant rolling hills, woodland, and lochs. From our hotel, we could explore the lush Scottish scenery, something Jenna had wanted to do ever since she was a kid. Her mother was Scottish, and although she had passed away when my wife was very young, Jenna always felt a deep connection to the country. It was a spiritual home of sorts. She was absolutely fascinated by it. The vast spaces of green and rock, clear blue waters, snow, rain, wind, and sun piercing through it if you were lucky. It was a natural world in its element. Most of all, Jenna cherished the few memories that she had of her mother telling stories about Scotland. It was a mystical place for both her and her family, and that pull to see it firsthand only grew over the years. I had spent my childhood in a small town in the Midwest. I'd had my fill of nature and preferred the streets of Boston as an adult, but when my wife turned 30, I knew that a trip across the Atlantic would make the perfect present. And when I told her where we were going, she was so happy. Aberfoyle Village was barely more than a main street at the time, with our hotel, well, I say hotel, but it was more of a bed and breakfast, sitting on one of the rare empty back streets. At night, the place shut down except for a solitary pub, leaving us to breathe in the relative silence and darkness of the surrounding hills and forests. The first night there, we had dinner at a small restaurant. That night brought with it more than its fair share of surprises. The first was when I surprised Jenna with a silver bracelet engraved with a suitably soppy message on the underside. But that wasn't where the unexpected ceased. Jenna then dropped the biggest surprise of all. She was pregnant with our first child. We had been trying for over a year and we were beginning to worry that something was wrong, and so to hear that she was pregnant was overwhelming. And we celebrated, Jenna on the orange juice and me on the scotch. The next day, my head was pounding, and I asked that we stay closer to the hotel rather than go on our planned trip to Glasgow City. Jenna was a little put out, but by lunchtime, my headache had lifted a little and I suggested a walk through the countryside as a compromise. The night before, one of the locals had told me about a scenic walk through Queen Elizabeth Forest. It sounded perfect and just a short drive away. If I had to hurl, at least I wouldn't be doing it in front of other people. Jenna was excited to get out and about, and so we drove for about 20 minutes from Aberfoyle and parked in a small makeshift parking lot inside the forest. This was the place the trail started, and they could only be explored on foot. When we got out, the scent of pines was sweet in the air, and the fresh smell made me feel so much better. Although I've been told the location is now more popular, on that particular day we saw no other cars on the road into the forest, and the parking lot itself was empty. The sun was high in the sky, and as we headed on foot towards what was supposed to be a relaxing forest walk, I remember smiling at Jenna. She was so beautiful. A wooden information board showed us the route that we were to take. Given her condition, I didn't want Jenna to overexert herself, so we took the path marked in green, which was meant to be the easiest trail, and it was, for a while. The path moved through pockets of pine trees and had clearly been used many times before. It was picturesque, and with each step I started to understand why Jenna had been so excited to visit the area. There's undoubtedly something necessary about getting away from the world to lose yourself in nature. It's like we still have an ancient part of ourselves that gets nourished by the deep greenery. As we strolled along the dirt path, we started talking about what we would call the baby if it were a boy or a girl. But it was then that we realized that we were no longer alone. In front of us, in the distance, a young boy walked out from the tree line and stood on the path just 50 yards away, just staring at us. He looked to be about 8 or maybe 9 years old. Being in an isolated area, it would have been unnerving to begin with to see a kid on their own, but what immediately filled me with disbelief was the fact that the boy was clearly naked. The sun reflected off of his skin and his pale color was stark against the green of the forest. What do you do in a situation like that? This was the 1970s, and although there were always whispers about terrible things happening behind closed doors, it was long before the public truly accepted that many children were being abused or mistreated. Still, the unsettling sight was soon replaced for concern for Jenna. Jenna picked up the pace and shouted, "Hello?" But something immediately made me grab her hand and stop her from running up to the boy. I asked Jenna to stay put, not just for herself, but for our unborn child's sake. The last thing I wanted was for a stressful situation to affect the pregnancy. Reluctantly, she stayed where she was, and I stepped forwards towards the boy. As I drew closer, I realized how pale and emaciated he was, as though he had been kept somewhere, malnourished and away from sunlight for some time. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Where are your parents?" He just looked at me, the patches beneath his eyes darker than the surrounding skin. Cautiously, I moved closer with my arms open so as not to scare him and said, "Let us help you. Maybe we can take you to the police or find your parents?" But the nearer I got, the more I felt the uncertainty of the situation. There was something very wrong with this boy. I expected him to move back or show some sort of fear, but he didn't. In fact, I was sure that a subtle grin momentarily flickered across his face before returning to the same somber expression as before. By this time, I was standing straight in front of him. So I asked him, "What's your name?" Again, he said nothing, but now he was looking intently into my eyes, and that gaze carried with it nothing but menace. The boy then reached out his hand and touched the center of my chest. The touch of his fingers left me unsure of myself. I turned to look back at Jenna down the path to ask her what I should do, but as I turned, I heard a rustling sound, and when I looked back towards the boy, he was no longer there. I followed the rustling to the side of the path. The ground dipped down into a slight incline. There, the trees and bushes created thick clumps of leaves and branches. It looked difficult to traverse, and I thought that the boy's naked skin must have been scraped and cut into pieces running through there. It was so dim between the trees, a tangled green mess. Waiting for a moment, I listened. There was nothing other than the occasional creak of a branch swaying in the gentle breeze. Above, the sun shone down directly onto the path, but just a few steps forward and I would have been engulfed by the dark of the forest. The difference in light was stark in my mind, and although I wanted to help the kid, everything about the situation left me in a wary state of mind. Seeing no sign of the boy, I walked back to Jenna. She asked me where I was. I said that I didn't know, and I told her that he disappeared into the forest when my back was turned. Jenna's face had grown pale, and she gave me a look I knew only too well. I'd seen it a few times over the past few years. Something was on her mind and she just had to get it out. She looked at me straight in the eyes and said, "I never saw the boy leave the path." She insisted that it was as if he had just vanished. One moment he was there and the next, gone. Now I was caught in a difficult situation. This was long before the common cell phone. One of us needed to alert the authorities that there was a young boy stranded in the woods, running around as naked as the day he was born. Considering how deep and thick that section of the forest around us was, he could have easily fallen and hit his head on a rock, or later died of hypothermia when the night came. There was only one thing that we could do. One of us had to stay put in case the kid needed help, while the other would walk back to the car, drive into Aberfoyle, and raise the alarm. There was no question that I was the one to stay in the forest, but I didn't feel right about letting Jenna go back to the car by herself. Even if she hadn't been pregnant, I wouldn't have liked it. But Jenna was always stronger-willed than me, and although I would try to pull the usual strong husband routine that was common at the time, she was nearly always immune to it. Jenna insisted that she would head back down the path and that I should try to find the kid, but not to stray too far. She would be back as soon as possible with the help. I told her to honk the horn when she was leaving the parking lot. That way I'd know she got back to the car okay. I got a smile and a roll of the eyes in return, but she promised to do it if it would make me feel better. She gave me a kiss on the cheek and walked back the way that we came. I watched her until she disappeared from view. Although I'd spent the last 10 years living in Boston, I grew up in the Midwest, and so hikes through the woods were not alien to me. But this was very different. There was something off about the long stretch of path. It was flanked by pine trees so close together that the forest was as dark as twilight once you stepped off the path and into it, and that was something I had no intention of doing. The tree line was like an impenetrable wall to me. Nonetheless, I stared intently at it in search of the smallest sign of life. I was sure that since I hadn't heard anyone moving around in there, the boy must still have been near. He would have made too much noise moving through the uneven and cluttered terrain. There was a sense of loneliness about that place. No, not loneliness, but isolation. Like it was an arm cut off from the body of the world. Such environments infect the mind with paranoia, and as I was entering the stark atmosphere of the place, I kept my eyes on the side of the path from where the boy had first appeared. My imagination took over. I began to think about the kid lost in the woods. I thought about how we might have gotten in such a situation, and those thoughts were too dark to dwell on. I turned my mind to a lighter explanation. Maybe there was a loch nearby, and he was swimming there with his friends, I thought. Maybe they took his clothing as a prank, and then he'd followed the path trying to get back to town. Yes, that made sense. It must have been something like that. But why not speak to me, and what of his skin? It was unusually pale, and that flicker of a smile on his face. It caused me doubt just to think about it. Continuing my vigil, I wondered why Jenna hadn't honked the car horn yet as she was leaving the parking lot. I was sure that she would have made it back there by then. That is when I thought I saw movement. I didn't know if it was a deer or the missing boy himself. Slowly, I stepped forward to the edge of the path and peered in. The quiet of this place took over, and I stared steadily for any hint of movement. I was so focused I had no time to react to the real danger. Something walked out of the woods from behind me at speed. I barely had a moment to turn, and when I did, something large and white put its hands on me. It knocked me from the path, and as I fell down the incline into the trees and bushes in front of me, a searing pain cut across my vision. A branch of pine needle scratched across my left eyeball, leaving me unable to see out of it. Instinct kicked in, and I fled deeper between the trees, the branches cracking and prodding around me as I did so. Blood and tears oozed from my injured left eye, and as I looked back momentarily with my right, I saw, standing on the sunlit path, two people, a man and a woman. Both were naked, and their skin was as white as the boy's I had seen, gleaming in the summer sun. Both figures stepped forward towards where I was, so I quickly attempted to hide within a cutting embrace of the large pine tree, but it was clear that they could see me somehow from the path, even though I was shrouded by the dim light of the forest. It was at that moment that I heard the distant sound of a car horn. A sense of relief cut through the adrenaline. I could at least be happy that Jenna made it back to the car without incident, hopefully out of the forest and away from the attackers. The man and the woman didn't even flinch at the sound. They stared at me through the trees, their gaze dark and malevolent, angry even. When he and the woman moved further towards where I stood, I panicked and picked up a moss-covered rock on the ground at my feet. It was the only way to protect myself. I watched, anticipating their movements, waiting for them to attack. That's when the woman stopped and spoke to the man. Her words were unlike any I had ever heard before. It wasn't just the language that confused me, but I'm uncertain how any human could make such a sound. Beneath the words, there was an unusual noise. Each word lay on top of a breath, like a storm swelling and pushing through a constricted space. The man answered with a lower yet equally airy voice. There we were, waiting to see who would move first. I might not have understood the language, but I knew they meant harm to me, and for the first time, the thought that I might never leave that forest alive actually rose up in my mind. The man stood glaring at me, his eyes dark and intense. I wondered why he was hesitating. It clearly wasn't out of fear. He looked like he was almost enjoying himself. The same strange grin the vanishing boy had occasionally flickered across his mouth. Just as I began to calm myself, thinking maybe they were going to leave me alone, the man finally lurched forward where I was. He was moving in on me, slipping between the jagged branches of the forest with unnatural ease. With the blood still streaming from my eye, I couldn't see well. I tried moving backwards away from the approaching figure, but I quickly got tangled up in a wave of leaves and dead branches. In just a moment, he was going to be upon me, and I could imagine his pale, cold hands wrapped around my throat. But that was, believe it or not, the least of my concerns. If the sound of Jenna striking our car horn made me feel at ease, thinking she was safe, the second time it sounded put me on edge. When the horn sounded distant for a third and then a final fourth time, I knew something terrible had happened. Jenna needed my help. There was no time for dialogue. These people, whoever they were, had undoubtedly hurt that boy that we had encountered, and now they were hell-bent on hurting me and my wife. Who knew how many of them that there were? I had to get back to Jenna to make sure that she was okay. The man continued moving forward, the pine branches slipping against his skin. When he finally reached me, I leapt forward and swung the rock in my hand with all my might. When I contacted with his head, I was certain that I had killed him, but something cracked inside of his skull. I felt it. Blood splattered across me, and he staggered back from the forest and up onto the trail before finally collapsing. I will never forget the piercing, inhuman scream the woman let out when she leaned over to help her bloodied companion. The man's pale white face had come apart from the attack, his features now a flap of skin hanging from the side of his head. Enraged, the woman stood up as if to come at me. Shocked at what I had done, I ran back down the path, grasping for breath. Looking back with my one good eye, I could see that she was still with the man's crumpled body, and so I focused purely on reaching Jenna. When I got to the parking lot, I wasn't sure what I saw at first. The car door was open and Jenna was lying in the driver's seat. A small, pale white figure was hunched over her, doing something. As I ran to the car, the figure, who I could now see was the boy we had first encountered, let out an airy screech and held a bloody mess in his hands. I was too late. The boy scampered off towards the surrounding forest, but as he reached the tall grass just before the tree line, he stopped. Crouching down, he turned and stared at me, showing off the mass of human tissue that he'd torn from my wife's body, as if proud of what he had done. He seemed to take no notice that his white skin was bleached red with the blood of my wife and my unborn baby. At the sight of this, I no longer cared if I was going to die. I took a deep breath and turned to look at what he had done to Jenna. She was sitting in the driver's seat, her eyes glazed, but I didn't understand. She was looking up at me in a daze, smiling. There was no blood, no visible wound from what I could see. I dreamt about our child, she said. Then she lost consciousness. I pulled her still breathing body from the driver's seat and laid her gently on her back. She was talking to herself, mumbling something, as though she were in a deep, confusing dream. My only thought was to get her to a hospital. Climbing into the car, I slammed the door shut. For some reason, I noticed the tree line, the trees moving together in a breeze, swaying happily, despite the carnage happening below. All the while, the boy, covered in blood and nestling something in his hands, stared at me from the tall grass. But he was no longer alone. The man and the woman I had encountered on the path were with him, and the man, though he bore a scar down the side of his cheek, looked as though his entire face had been sewn back on. They watched silently as I drove out of the parking lot, and I was left with an uneasy feeling that they had allowed me to leave. Jenna recovered at a local hospital, and to my complete surprise and joy, our baby was still alive and healthy inside of its mother. We spoke with the local police. Of course, no one believed us, and why would they? There wasn't a scratch on Jenna, and bizarrely, even the blood which had sprayed across me during the fight on the forest path had vanished like disappearing ink. The only evidence that something had happened was a cut across my eyeball that never properly healed. When I asked Jenna what had happened at the parking lot, she said that all she remembered was a flash of white on the windscreen, as if something had jumped up on the hood of the car. Then, nothing. But she did say that she dreamt about a crying baby. Months later, when we were back in Boston, Jenna gave birth to our son. He was beautiful. We were happy for a few days. But to our horror, just a short while after getting him home, his skin began to change color, like food going bad because of the air. His skin darkened with mold and he cried for his life. I called 911, but it was too late. He stopped breathing in Jenna's arms. We were overcome with grief that I simply cannot describe. Looking down at our beautiful boy, his skin was now a rotting piece of meat, and his eyes frozen open looking up at us. We both knew something had been done to him. I will never forget the agonizing cry of loss that my wife let out in that moment. Then I heard the paramedics come into our home downstairs, but before they reached us, the miraculous happened. Suddenly, our son began breathing again. His eyes rolled around, and then his skin began to change color back to its original, healthy tone. But the change did not stop. It grew paler and paler until there was no doubt that we were staring at one of the children from the forest. Before our very eyes, and I will swear to this until my dying breath, our son then began to fade away, just as the blood had evaporated on my clothes when I was attacked. As the last outline of him vanished, he let out the laugh of a child far older than his few days. That laugh moved off into the air and then through the nearest window, fading to nothing. If it wasn't for the paramedics who saw the last moment for themselves, the police would have thought that we disposed of our own child. We didn't. He was never our child to begin with. He was of the forest, and I'm certain that's where he now lives, lost in a sea of green. And what of our unborn child? Was he taken from Jenna's body in the forest? Is it possible that he too lives there? That possibility haunts me, as do the memories I've finally put into these words. Jenna and I remained married, though we swore that after that day we would never have another child. Perhaps the effects of what we encountered in the forest that day still linger in her body. Who knows what we would have brought into this world? If I outlive my wife, and I hope that I don't, I will have nothing left. If that occurs, I know what I'll do. Jenna made me swear to never go back to where we encountered those people. She said that nothing good could come from it. I've held true to that promise, but if I'm ever left alone in this world, it's then that I'll go back to that forest by Aberfoyle Village and walk into its embrace. If there's anything left of my child, maybe I'll meet it there. Be sure to tune in every Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for brand new content from me. And remember to follow me on Discord and Twitch, as well as my team who make these videos possible. You'll find all of their respective links in the description below this video. Thanks for watching.